October 1944, Breskens Pocket, Netherlands. The North Sea wind howled across the flat Dutch coastline, carrying the smell of salt and gunpowder. Major Jack Morrison stood in a muddy trench, staring at the concrete fortress 200 yards away. Rain hammered against his helmet and ran down his neck in cold streams. Behind him, 34 wooden crosses stood in neat rows marking fresh graves. 34 Canadian soldiers dead in 3 days, trying to take that one fortress. 34 families back home who would get telegrams saying their sons and husbands were never coming back. The fortress rose from the seawall like a giant tooth made of gray concrete. 12 feet of reinforced walls surrounded it on every side. Nazi engineers had built it in 1942 as part of the Atlantic Wall defenses. Small windows cut into the concrete allowed German machine guns to sweep every approach. Inside those walls, Major Klaus Richter commanded 180 Wehrmacht soldiers. They had enough food for 6 weeks. They had ammunition stacked floor to ceiling. They had 3 artillery pieces that could hit ships 15 miles away. And Major Richter had sent one message to the Canadians 3 days ago that made his position absolutely clear. A Canadian lieutenant had walked to the fortress under a white flag carrying a letter. The letter was simple: "Surrender now, and your men will be treated well as prisoners of war. Fight, and we will destroy you." 1 hour later, the German response came back written in perfect English on expensive paper. Major Richter's words were cold and direct. "I am a German officer. I do not negotiate with liberators who are invaders. My men will fight to the last bullet. You may waste your soldiers trying to take this fortress. We will still be here when you give up and leave." This single fortress was stopping the entire Allied war effort. 30 miles away sat the port of Antwerp. Antwerp was the second biggest port in Europe. Through that port, the Allies could bring 4,000 tons of supplies every single day. Fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, food for soldiers, medicine for field hospitals. Everything the armies needed to push into Germany and end the war. But none of those supplies could reach Antwerp, while Major Richter controlled the Scheldt estuary. His artillery guns commanded the water route. Any Allied ship trying to pass would be blown apart. The Germans knew this. Richter knew this. And that knowledge made him confident he could hold his fortress forever. The Allied commanders had thrown everything they had at the problem. British destroyers sailed close to shore and fired 500 shells at the concrete walls. The shells exploded in huge fountains of fire and smoke. When the smoke cleared, the walls showed no damage. The concrete was too thick. The shells just bounced off or exploded harmlessly on the surface. American generals wanted to use heavy bombers to drop 1,000-pound bombs on the fortress. But Dutch civilian families still lived in houses 30 yards away. Bombing would kill innocent people. The commanders refused to give that order. So the Canadians tried infantry assaults. The first attack came at dawn 2 days ago. 80 men charged across the open ground toward the fortress. German machine guns opened fire when the Canadians were 150 yards away. 23 men died in the first 90 seconds. 19 more fell wounded. The survivors crawled back to the trenches, dragging their injured friends. The second assault came that afternoon with smoke grenades and covering fire. 60 Canadians advanced through the smoke. The Germans waited silently until the Canadians were 50 feet away. Then they opened fire using the sound of footsteps to aim through the smoke. 24 more Canadians fell. The third assault came the next morning with different tactics and more artillery support. The result was the same: more wooden crosses, more letters to write to families, more failure. A British admiral visited the Canadian positions that rainy morning. He wore a clean uniform and shiny boots that had never seen mud. He pointed at the fortress with his walking stick and spoke with absolute certainty. "We will continue the naval bombardment," he said. "Bigger guns are coming. We will pound them day and night until the concrete cracks." An American general stood beside him, nodding his head. "Acceptable casualties," the American said. "Send another infantry wave with better support. Eventually, their defenses will break." The Canadian officers listened to this advice and felt sick in their stomachs. More bombing had failed 500 times already. More soldiers charging across open ground would just mean more graves. But winter storms were coming. In 48 hours, heavy weather would make any naval operations impossible. If they did not take the fortress before the storms arrived, they would have to wait until spring. Every day of delay meant 4,000 tons of supplies stuck in warehouses instead of reaching the front lines. Major Jack Morrison studied the map spread across a wooden ammunition crate and said nothing during the meeting. He was 29 years old, with weathered skin and strong hands scarred from years of hard work. Before the war, Morrison had been a deep-sea fisherman in Newfoundland. He knew boats and nets and the moods of the ocean. He understood how to read weather in the color of clouds and the smell of the wind. When ice jams blocked fishing harbors in winter, Morrison was the man the villages called. He would drill precise holes in the ice and place dynamite charges in exactly the right spots. One explosion would break the jam and the ice would flow out to sea with the current. The Canadian Army made him a combat engineer because he was an expert with explosives, and he never panicked under pressure. Now, Morrison ignored the generals arguing about artillery and looked at something they had completely overlooked: tide charts. The Scheldt estuary had the second highest tides in all of Europe. At high tide, the water rose 23 feet above mean sea level. At low tide, the water dropped 22 feet below mean level. 45 feet of total difference between high and low tide, twice every day. Morrison studied the fortress blueprints that had been captured from a German engineering officer. The fortress sat directly on top of the seawall, not behind it, not dug into the land, right on top of the wall itself. The foundation was built at mean sea level, 0 feet of elevation. Morrison could see drainage pumps marked on the blueprints. They were designed to handle normal rainfall and normal tides. But what would happen if the water was not normal? Morrison stared at the gray North Sea stretching to the horizon. He thought about fish swimming through currents and tides. Fish never fought against the ocean. They used the water's power to move where they wanted to go. They let the current carry them. Morrison had spent 15 years on fishing boats learning that same lesson. You do not fight the sea, you work with it. He looked back at the tide charts, and then at the seawall, and then at the fortress. His finger traced the path water would take if the seawall was breached at the right spot at the right time. And for the first time in 3 days, Major Jack Morrison smiled. He whispered to himself in the cold rain, "Fish don't fight the current. They use it, and I know exactly how to use it." Morrison requested an urgent meeting with his engineering team that afternoon. 6 men gathered in a supply tent out of the rain. Morrison spread his maps and tide charts across a table made from stacked ammunition boxes. The engineers crowded around, looking at the papers covered in Morrison's handwritten notes and calculations. Morrison pointed to a spot on the map 200 yards west of the fortress. "Here," he said. "The British naval bombardment 3 weeks ago damaged this section of the seawall. I have seen it through binoculars. The concrete is cracked and broken. This is our weak point." A young lieutenant named Davies leaned closer to study the map. "What are you thinking, sir?" Morrison traced his finger from the damaged wall section to the fortress. "If we breach the wall here at low tide, the North Sea will pour through the gap. The water will spread across this entire area. When high tide comes 6 hours later, millions of gallons will flood the fortress basement and lower levels. Their ammunition will be underwater. Their supplies will be ruined. They will be standing in 6 feet of seawater with no way to pump it out fast enough. Davies stared at the map, trying to understand. You want to drown them out? Morrison shook his head. I want to make their fortress unlivable. I want to give them a choice between surrendering or drowning. They will choose surrender. A sergeant named Mackenzie asked the practical question, how much explosive do we need to blow a hole in that wall? Morrison had already done the mathematics on paper. The damaged section is 30 feet wide and the wall is 8 feet thick at that point. We need 400 pounds of explosives placed deep in the cracks. Shape charges to direct the blast inward toward the landside. We detonate at the exact moment of low tide when water pressure is at its minimum. The wall will blow open and the sea will do the rest of our work for us. Mackenzie let out a low whistle. 400 pounds is a lot of explosives, sir. Where do we get that much? Morrison smiled. We borrow it. 10 pounds from this engineer company. 20 pounds from that one. 15 pounds from another. Nobody will notice until after we are done, and by then it will not matter. But first, Morrison needed to confirm his plan would actually work. That night, he picked 6 engineers who were strong swimmers. They put on dark clothes and blackened their faces with mud. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. Perfect conditions for invisible work. At 11 o'clock, they slipped into the freezing North Sea and swam toward the damaged section of wall. The water felt like knives of ice stabbing into Morrison's skin. His breath came in short gasps. The tide was going out. In 3 hours, it would reach its lowest point of the day. The 6 men reached the seawall and climbed onto the exposed rocks and concrete. Barnacles cut their hands. Seaweed made the surface slippery and treacherous. Morrison pulled a small flashlight from his waterproof pouch and shielded it with his hand. He examined the cracks in the concrete wall. The damage was even better than he had hoped. British shells had fractured the wall deep into its structure. He could push his entire fist into some of the gaps. These cracks would be perfect places to nestle explosive charges. Morrison pulled out a cloth tape measure and took careful measurements. The damaged section was 32 feet wide. The wall thickness at this point was 8 feet. The foundation extended 12 feet below the current water level. He wrote everything down on waterproof paper with a grease pencil. The other engineers explored the wall in both directions for 200 yards. They found the best route to approach without being seen by German sentries. They identified spots where they would be hidden by shadows and rocks. After 90 minutes of cold work, they slid back into the black water and swam to shore. Morrison's whole body shook from the cold. His teeth chattered so hard he bit his tongue. But he had the information he needed. The plan would work. The next morning, Morrison presented his plan to the Allied command. The meeting took place in a farmhouse that smelled of wet wool and tobacco smoke. The British admiral stood with his arms crossed over his chest. His face turned red as Morrison explained the flooding operation. "You want to flood a Dutch town?" he shouted. "Absolutely unacceptable. We cannot destroy civilian property." Morrison kept his voice calm and respectful. "Sir, the Dutch government evacuated every civilian from this area 2 weeks ago. The town is completely empty. The buildings are already destroyed by artillery fire. We would not be flooding anyone's home. We would be flooding an abandoned battlefield." The American general interrupted with his own objection. "What if this scheme fails? What if you blow the wall and the water does not reach the fortress? Then what?" Morrison had prepared for this question. "Then we are in exactly the same position we are in right now, sir. The fortress still stands and we try a different approach. But if the plan succeeds, we take that position without losing one more soldier. The British admiral shook his head firmly. This is madness. Proper military doctrine says we continue the bombardment. We bring in heavier naval guns, we pound them until they break. The American general nodded his agreement. We should launch another infantry assault with better artillery preparation. That is how wars are won, through superior firepower and determination. Morrison felt frustration building inside his chest, but he kept his face neutral and professional. The so-called proper way had already killed 34 of his friends. The proper way was failing. But Morrison was only a major. These men were an admiral and a general. He could not force them to listen to a fisherman from Newfoundland who thought he knew better than professional military commanders. Then a voice spoke from the doorway. "I think the major's plan is excellent." Everyone in the room turned to look. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons walked into the farmhouse. He commanded the entire 2nd Canadian Corps. He was the highest-ranking Canadian officer in the Netherlands. Simmons looked directly at the British admiral and the American general with cold gray eyes. "The British want to keep bombing," Simmons said quietly. "The Americans want to keep charging men across open ground. I want my soldiers to go home to their families alive." He turned to face Morrison. "Major, you have 24 hours to make this work. Use whatever resources you need. I will handle anyone who objects." Morrison and his engineering team worked through the night gathering supplies. They visited 3 different Canadian engineer companies spread across 5 miles of frontline positions. 10 pounds of explosives from one unit, 15 pounds from another, 25 pounds from a third unit. The engineers who gave up their explosives asked no questions. They understood that engineers helped each other. By dawn, Morrison had 400 pounds of various explosives assembled in a barn. Now came the tricky part. The charges had to stay completely dry even when placed underwater at the base of the wall. Morrison and his men wrapped each bundle of explosives in rubberized canvas tarps that were normally used to cover military vehicles. They sealed every edge with waterproof tape. Morrison rigged the detonators using modified artillery fuses connected to a waterproof watch mechanism. If the primary detonator somehow failed, backup fuses would trigger automatically 15 minutes later. Nothing could be left to chance. Too many lives depended on this working perfectly. For transportation to the seawall, Morrison contacted the Dutch resistance through Canadian intelligence officers. The resistance provided a fishing boat with a quiet engine that would not alert German sentries. Morrison knew boats intimately. He had spent 15 years on fishing vessels in the dangerous North Atlantic waters off Newfoundland. He understood currents and tides and how to navigate in complete darkness using only the feel of the wind and the sound of the waves. The boat was loaded carefully with the waterproofed explosives. Morrison checked the tide charts one final time. Low tide would occur at exactly 3:47 in the morning on October 28th. His team would have a window of only 20 minutes. 20 minutes to reach the wall. 20 minutes to place 400 pounds of explosives in the cracks. 20 minutes to wire all the detonators correctly. 20 minutes to get back to safety before the tide turned and the water started rising again. Morrison looked at his watch and then at his 6 engineers. Their faces were grim but determined. They climbed into the fishing boat as the sun set over the cold, gray North Sea. The engine started with a quiet rumble. Morrison steered the boat toward the darkness and the waiting seawall. "Hey, quick pause here. A few years ago, my dad started having serious back problems from just sitting and watching TV. He's a history buff too, probably where I got it from. I wished I'd known about something like the relax cushion back then. It's designed specifically for long periods of sitting and helps with back, hip, and tailbone pain. So if you or someone you care about deals with that kind of discomfort, check it out via the first link in the description. Take care of yourself. Now, back to the video. The fishing boat cut through the black water in complete silence. Morrison stood at the wheel, steering by instinct and memory. No lights, no engine noise louder than a whisper. The North Sea stretched around them like liquid darkness. Morrison checked his waterproof watch. 3:15 in the morning. 32 minutes until low tide. 32 minutes until the moment when everything had to be perfect. The damaged section of seawall appeared ahead as a darker shadow against the night sky. Morrison guided the boat close, and his engineers jumped onto the slippery rocks. They worked in total silence, passing the waterproofed explosive bundles from hand to hand. Each man knew his job. They had practiced the movements 20 times on land. Now they executed the plan in the freezing darkness with numb fingers and racing hearts. Morrison climbed onto the wall and found the largest crack. He pushed a 40-pound bundle of explosives deep into the gap. The concrete edges scraped his knuckles raw. He did not notice the pain. Lieutenant Davies worked 3 feet away, placing another charge. Sergeant Mackenzie wedged explosives into a vertical crack that ran 8 feet down into the wall's foundation. 18 minutes until low tide. Morrison connected the detonator wires with fingers that barely had feeling left. The waterproof watch mechanism ticked quietly in his hands. He set it for 3:47 exactly. If he set it wrong by even 1 minute, the plan could fail. Too early, and the water pressure would be too high. Too late, and the rising tide would already be pushing back against the breach. Morrison's hands moved with the careful precision of 15 years tying fishing nets in storms. Every connection had to be perfect. Every wire had to be secure. Mackenzie finished placing the last explosive bundle and gave Morrison a thumbs-up signal in the darkness. 11 minutes until low tide. The engineers scrambled back into the fishing boat. Morrison made one final check of the detonator connections. Everything looked correct. He jumped into the boat and pushed off from the wall. The quiet engine carried them 800 yards away to a position behind a rocky outcropping. They would be safe there from the blast and the initial surge of water. Morrison and his men crouched in the boat and waited. The wind picked up, carrying spray that stung their faces. The North Sea made small slapping sounds against the boat hull. Morrison watched his watch. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes. His heart hammered in his chest. 2 minutes, 1 minute. He whispered a prayer to himself. At exactly 3:47 in the morning on October 28th, 1944, 400 pounds of explosives detonated inside the seawall. The sound was not a sharp bang like artillery. It was a deep rumbling roar that came from inside the earth itself. Morrison felt the shock wave roll through the water and shake the boat. The seawall erupted in a fountain of concrete chunks and white spray. Pieces of broken wall flew 50 feet into the air and splashed down across 100 yards of ocean. When the spray cleared, Morrison could see a gap 30 feet wide where solid concrete had stood moments before. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the North Sea realized there was an opening and poured through with the force of an avalanche made of water. The sound was like Niagara Falls compressed into 30 feet of width. 50,000 gallons of seawater rushed through the breach every single minute. The flow created a current so strong that fish and debris spun in circles at the edges. Morrison watched the white wall of water surge across the flat ground toward the fortress 200 yards away. The water spread and slowed as it crossed the distance, but it kept coming. The North Sea had found a new path, and nothing could stop it now. Morrison checked his watch again. High tide would come at 9:47, 6 hours from now. The fortress had 6 hours before the real flooding began. Morrison and his men returned to Canadian lines and reported success to General Simons. Then Morrison positioned himself in an observation post with powerful binoculars. He had to see if his plan actually worked, or if he had just wasted 400 pounds of explosives on an elaborate failure. The hours passed slowly. Morrison watched the water creeping across the battlefield. At first, it was just a thin sheet spreading over mud and rocks. Then it began to pool in low spots. By 8 in the morning, the water was 1 foot deep across a 100-yard area around the fortress. By 9 in the morning, it was 2 feet deep and rising faster as the tide came in. Inside the fortress, Major Richter realized something was terribly wrong. Water was seeping up through floor drains in the basement. At first, his men tried to pump it out using the fortress drainage system. The pumps were designed to handle 5,000 gallons per hour, but the water was coming in at 50,000 gallons per minute. The pumps could not keep up. They choked and sputtered and then stopped working entirely. Richter ordered his men to sandbag the interior doors to keep water from spreading through the fortress. But water pressure does not care about sandbags. The water pushed through gaps and cracks with unstoppable force. At 9:30 in the morning, seawater reached the main ammunition storage room in the fortress basement. 18 feet of water filled the room in 20 minutes. Artillery shells and rifle ammunition floated and then sank. Salt water poured into wooden crates and cardboard boxes. Every explosive and every bullet in storage was now useless. Even if the Germans could dry them out later, salt water had already ruined the gunpowder. The fortress had just lost all its ammunition reserves. Richter tried to radio for help from German command. But the radio room was flooding, equipment sparked and died. His final transmission cut off in the middle of a sentence. The Canadians have weaponized the sea itself. We are being drowned in our own fortress. This is not warfare. The transmission ended. Morrison listened to the recording later and heard the panic in Richter's voice. At 9:47, high tide arrived. The water level jumped dramatically. Morrison watched through his binoculars as the fortress disappeared behind a sheet of spray and waves. When visibility cleared, water surrounded the entire structure. It poured through the main entrance doors. It flooded through ventilation shafts. It rose up the outside walls like the fortress was sinking into the ocean. Inside, German soldiers abandoned the lower levels and climbed stairs to upper floors. But the water kept rising, 6 feet deep in some corridors, 4 feet deep in the main command room. At 10:15 in the morning, Morrison saw movement on the fortress roof. German soldiers were climbing out through a rooftop hatch. They stood on the wet concrete looking down at the water covering their fortress. More soldiers appeared. Then more. Within 5 minutes, 80 German soldiers stood on the roof. At 10:30, a white flag appeared, a bedsheet tied to a broken radio antenna. The white fabric snapped and fluttered in the wind. Morrison felt relief flood through his entire body. It had worked. The plan had actually worked. At 10:45, the main fortress door opened. German soldiers began wading out through chest-deep water. Their hands were raised above their heads. Their uniforms were soaked. Their faces showed shock and confusion. They had expected to fight bullets and bombs. Instead, they had been defeated by the ocean itself. 180 German soldiers surrendered in groups of 10 and 20. They waded through the water toward Canadian lines. Some of them were crying. Some looked angry. Most just looked exhausted and beaten. Major Klaus Richter emerged last at 11 o'clock. He waded through the water still wearing his officer's cap. Water dripped from his uniform. He carried nothing except his dignity. A Canadian officer met him and accepted his formal surrender. Richter looked back at his fortress sitting in 6 feet of seawater. His voice was quiet when he spoke in English. "You did not fight us with guns. You fought us with the sea. I have been a soldier for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like this." The Canadian officer nodded. "War changes, sir. We adapt or we die." Richter handed over his pistol and became a prisoner of war. Morrison stood in the observation post and watched the last Germans surrender. Not one Canadian soldier had died in this operation, not one. The comparison to conventional assault made his chest tight with emotion. Military analysts later estimated a frontal assault would have cost 200 to 300 Canadian casualties. The actual cost was 400 pounds of explosives and 1 breached seawall. The Scheldt estuary was now open to Allied shipping. Within 72 hours, the first supply ships reached Antwerp. 4,000 tons of supplies every single day began flowing to Allied armies. The war would continue for 7 more months, but this moment marked a turning point. And it had been won not with superior firepower, but with superior thinking. Morrison had thought like a fisherman, not a soldier. And that made all the difference. The flooding of Major Richter's fortress changed how the Allies fought for the rest of the war. Within 1 week, every Canadian engineer unit requested copies of Morrison's plans. They wanted to know the exact mathematics, how much explosive for different wall thicknesses, how to calculate tidal flows, how to time detonations for maximum effect. Morrison sat in a farmhouse for 3 days straight writing detailed reports. He drew diagrams showing the placement of charges in wall cracks. He explained how to read tide charts and calculate water volumes. He wrote instructions on waterproofing explosives and building reliable timers. Every page was copied and distributed to Allied engineering units across Europe. By December 1944, British commandos used a similar flooding technique against German bunkers on the French coast. They breached a river levee at low water and flooded 3 enemy positions simultaneously. The Germans surrendered without firing a shot. In January 1945, Soviet engineers in Poland used controlled river flooding to force Germans out of fortified towns along the Vistula River. The tactic spread because it worked and because it saved lives on both sides. Military planners began teaching environmental warfare in engineering schools. Use the terrain, use the weather, use the water. Do not fight nature. Make nature fight for you. Lieutenant General Simons promoted Morrison to Lieutenant Colonel 2 weeks after the Breskins operation. Morrison took command of an entire Canadian engineer brigade. He led them through the Netherlands and into Germany during the final months of the war. His engineers built bridges under fire. They cleared minefields. They used explosives to break through defensive walls. Morrison's reputation grew. Other officers called him the fisherman because he always found ways to use water and terrain to solve problems that bullets could not solve. When the war ended in May 1945, Morrison had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order and mentioned in dispatches 3 times. He was 30 years old and tired to his bones. Morrison returned to Newfoundland in August 1946. He stepped off the ship onto familiar docks and breathed salt air that smelled like home. The war felt like a dream already fading. Morrison went back to fishing for 2 years, but the ocean had changed for him. He had seen too much, used too much. The water no longer felt peaceful. In 1948, he became harbor master for his home port. He managed boat traffic and tide schedules and repairs. He also started a small fishing fleet company. By 1960, he owned 12 boats and employed 40 men. Morrison never spoke about the war unless someone asked directly. Even then, his answers were short. What he did during the war was private. The memories belonged to him and to the men who had been there. Morrison lived quietly for 43 years after the war ended. He married in 1949, had 3 children, watched them grow up and have children of their own. He died in 1989 at age 74 from a heart attack while working on his boat. The people of Newfoundland remembered him as a good harbor master and a fair businessman. In 1991, the provincial government named a new bridge after him. The Morrison Bridge connected the mainland to a small fishing island. Most people who drove across that bridge never knew why it had that name. They did not know about the fortress, or the sea wall, or the 180 Germans who surrendered to seawater. Major Klaus Richter spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war in a Canadian camp. The Canadians treated him well. He had a bed and food and medical care. In June 1946, Richter returned to Germany and found his home city of Hamburg destroyed by Allied bombing. 70% of the city was rubble. His family home was gone. His wife had died in the bombing. His children had been sent to live with relatives in the countryside. Richter was 46 years old, and his entire world had been erased. The new German government would not allow former Wehrmacht officers to serve in any military capacity. Richter became a school teacher instead. He taught history and geography to children who had grown up during the war. He never talked about his military service. But in 1962, at age 62, Richter wrote a memoir called Fortress of Water. The book described his experience at Breskens. He wrote about the moment he realized the Canadians were flooding his position. He wrote about the fear of drowning in his own fortress. He wrote about the shame of surrender and the relief of survival. The book's final chapter acknowledged Morrison's tactic as militarily brilliant and morally sound. Richter wrote that Morrison had defeated him without massacre. That distinction mattered. In 1978, Richter traveled to Newfoundland. He was 78 years old and wanted to meet the man who had flooded him out 34 years earlier. Richter found Morrison working on a fishing boat in the harbor. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Morrison invited Richter aboard his boat. They spent the afternoon on the water, not saying much. They watched the tides come in and go out. They felt the wind and smelled the salt air. When they returned to shore, Richter shook Morrison's hand and said something Morrison never forgot. "You understood the ocean better than I understood concrete." Morrison smiled and replied that concrete was just concrete, but the ocean was alive. They parted as old men who had once been enemies and were now just two people who understood the sea. Richter died 3 years later in 1981 at age 81. The lessons from the Breskens flooding operation spread far beyond military circles. The story taught 3 important truths about solving impossible problems. First, use your environment as an ally instead of an obstacle. Morrison did not see the ocean as something in his way. He saw it as a weapon more powerful than any gun. Professional soldiers thought like soldiers. Morrison thought like a fisherman. That different perspective changed everything. Second, winning without killing is still winning. Morrison saved Canadian lives by not sending them to die in frontal assaults. He also saved German lives by giving them a choice to surrender instead of fight to the death. 180 German soldiers went home after the war because Morrison chose water over bullets. Third, questioning authority can save lives. The British admiral wanted more bombing. The American general wanted more infantry charges. Morrison questioned whether their way was the only way. His willingness to challenge conventional thinking led to a breakthrough that saved hundreds of lives. Modern militaries still study Morrison's operation in engineering schools and staff colleges. The principles he demonstrated remain relevant. During conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, coalition forces use controlled flooding to force enemies out of fortified positions. In urban combat, engineers redirect water from damaged pipes and canals to flood basement bunkers. The technology has advanced, but the basic idea stays the same. Use the environment, use physics, use nature's power instead of fighting against it. In the current war in Ukraine, both sides use dam controls and river flooding as tactical weapons. Every time military engineers breach a dam or redirect a river, they are using tactics that trace back to a Newfoundland fisherman standing in Dutch rain, staring at tide charts. Morrison gave only one interview about the Breskins operation. In 1987, 2 years before his death, a military historian visited him in Newfoundland. Morrison was 72 years old. The historian asked him to explain his thinking. Morrison sat on his porch overlooking the harbor and spoke slowly. "I was a fisherman before I was a soldier," he said. "Fishermen learn early that you do not fight the ocean. The ocean is too big and too strong. You learn to work with its power instead. You use the tides. You use the currents. You let the water carry you where you want to go. The sea does not care about human wars. It just moves according to the moon and the wind. We did not fight the Germans with the ocean. We just asked the ocean to move at the right time in the right direction. After that, gravity and water pressure did all the work. We just had to get out of the way and let nature be nature." That understanding captures the deepest meaning of Morrison's achievement. The most human response to violence is not always more violence. Sometimes the answer is understanding forces bigger than human conflict. Water and tides and gravity do not care about politics or nationalism or military doctrine. They just follow natural laws. Morrison understood those laws better than he understood military tactics. And that knowledge saved lives on both sides of a terrible war. The Breskins fortress fell not because Canadians were stronger or braver than Germans. It fell because one man looked at an impossible problem and asked a different kind of question. Not how do we break through concrete, but how do we make concrete irrelevant? The answer was always there in the tide charts and the North Sea. Morrison just had to see it.
March 1978, the North Atlantic. The ocean is not silent. To the untrained ear, it is a tomb, a vast crushing abyss of black water and freezing temperatures. But to Captain First-Rank Valery Kulikov, standing in the cramped, humid control center of a Soviet Project 671 submarine, known to the West as the Victor class, the ocean is a cacophony. It is a noisy, chaotic battlefield. There is the groan of tectonic plates shifting miles below, the shrill songs of whales echoing across thermal layers, and the constant rhythmic churning of the surface waves crashing far above. Kulikov is a veteran of the Northern Fleet. He knows these sounds. He knows how to hide inside them. His mission, handed down directly from the Admiralty in Severomorsk, is simple on paper but terrifying in practice. Breach the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, disappear into the open Atlantic, and simulate a missile strike vector against the American eastern seaboard. This is the holy grail of Soviet naval doctrine. If a Victor-class submarine can vanish into the Atlantic undetected, the Soviet Union holds a knife to the throat of the United States. It means the balance of power is maintained. It means the Americans cannot strike first, because they do not know where the retaliation will come from. Kulikov checks the depth gauge, 200 meters. Speed, 5 knots. At this speed, the Victor is a ghost. The screw is barely turning, generating zero cavitation. The machinery inside the hull is mounted on rubber rafts to dampen vibration. They are running ultra-quiet. In the mind of Captain Kulikov and his political officer, they are a hole in the water. They do not exist. The navigation officer marks their position on the chart with a grease pencil. They are crossing the threshold. the invisible line between the Barents Sea and the open ocean. This is the danger zone. This is where the Americans hunt. But Kulikov is confident. His hydroacoustic operators report clear water. No propeller noises, no active sonar pings, no American hunter-killer submarines trailing their wake. They are safe. They have slipped the net. And then, the impossible happens. It does not begin with a bang, but with a sound that makes the blood freeze in the veins of every man in the command center. Splash, splash, splash. It is the distinct, terrifying sound of objects hitting the water from the air. Hydroacoustics! Kulikov snaps, his voice cutting through the humidity. Report! The sonar operator presses the headphones hard against his skull, his eyes wide with confusion. Captain, sonobuoys, active pattern. They are dropping them right on top of us. Kulikov's heart hammers against his ribs. This makes no sense. To drop sonobuoys, listening devices deployed from aircraft, the Americans must know exactly where the submarine is. But that is physically impossible. The Soviet submarine has been silent for 3 days. They have not used their radar. They have not used their radio. They have not surfaced. There is no ship above them. There is no American submarine behind them. Emergency dive! Kulikov roars. Rudder hard left. Flank speed. Get us under the thermal layer. The deck tilts violently. The calm silence of the control room shatters as the crew scrambles to their battle stations. The reactor hum rises to a whine as the turbines kick in. The stealth is gone now. Survival is the only objective. But as the Victor-class boat dives deep, twisting and turning to shake off the pursuit, the nightmare deepens. A dull, metallic thrum, thrum, thrum fills the water. It is the sound of powerful twin screws, an American destroyer. And it is not searching. It is driving fast, directly toward their intercept point. They are going active! The sonar operator screams. A split second later, the hull rings like a struck bell. Ping. The sound is so loud it feels like a physical blow. Active sonar. The Americans aren't looking for them anymore. They have found them. They have a firing solution. If this were a hot war, Kulikov and his 80 men would be dead in seconds, crushed by the pressure of the imploding hull before they even realized they had been hit. Kulikov grips the periscope railing, his knuckles white. Confusion wars with fear in his mind. This was not a chance encounter. The American aircraft did not just stumble upon them in millions of square miles of open ocean. They were waiting. They arrived at the exact coordinates, at the exact time, as if they had Kulikov's own charts in front of them. Evasive maneuvers, he orders, but his voice lacks the conviction of command. He knows deep down it is futile. For the next 4 hours, the Soviet submarine is hounded. Every time Kulikov changes course, the destroyers above adjust to match. Every time he tries to hide under a thermal layer, a temperature change in the water that usually deflects sonar, the sonobuoys are waiting for him on the other side. It is as if the ocean itself has turned transparent. It is as if the Americans are watching him through a glass floor. Finally, after an exhausting game of cat and mouse, the Americans break off. They have made their point. They have humiliated the pride of the Soviet Navy. Kulikov orders the boat to return to the Barents Sea. The mission is a failure. But the failure is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is the mystery. As the submarine limps back toward the ice, the officers gather in the wardroom, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fear. They do not speak of incompetence. They do not speak of bad luck. They speak of the phantom. There is no way they could have heard us, the chief engineer insists, slamming his hand on the table. Our machinery noise was below background levels. We were quieter than the shrimp. Physics says they cannot detect us. Maybe a satellite, the political officer suggests, his voice trembling. Maybe they have a satellite that can see through water. Impossible, Kulikov says, staring at the steel bulkhead. Water blocks radio waves. Water blocks light. No satellite can see a submarine at 200 meters. The silence that follows is heavy. If it is not a satellite, and it is not a spy ship, and it is not a traitor on board, then what is it? This incident in 1978 is not an isolated event. Across the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, the reports are beginning to pile up on the desks of the admirals in Moscow. A pattern is emerging, a terrifying, inexplicable pattern. Soviet submarines, the most expensive and complex machines ever built by the USSR, are being intercepted with impossible precision. They leave port in total secrecy. They follow randomized routes. They maintain strict radio silence. And yet, time and time again, they arrive at a remote patch of the Atlantic, only to find a US Navy P-3 Orion circling overhead, waiting for them like a vulture. To the Soviet High Command, this is not just a tactical problem, it is an existential crisis. The entire strategy of the Cold War relies on mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union builds thousands of nuclear missiles placed on submarines to guarantee that if America attacks, the submarines will survive to strike back. This guarantee is what keeps the peace. It is the shield of the motherland. But if the ocean is transparent, if the Americans can see every submarine, track every movement, and wait for every captain, then the shield is made of paper. The Kremlin is in a state of quiet panic. They are spending billions of rubles to build titanium hulls, quieter reactors, and faster torpedoes. They are bankrupting their economy to achieve naval parity. But it seems that no matter how much money they spend, the Americans are always one step ahead. They are fighting a ghost. Before we unravel this investigation and dive into the paranoia that gripped the Soviet intelligence services, take a moment to subscribe to Cold War Chronicles. We explore the hidden history of the conflict that defined our world, dissecting the technology and the strategies that kept the superpowers on the brink. Click the subscribe button to join the analysis. The stakes could not be higher. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military leadership is beginning to suspect something dark and supernatural about American technology. Imagine the psychological toll on the crews. Men like Captain Kulikov are trained to believe in their equipment. They are told that their vessel is the apex predator of the sea, but they are venturing out into the dark water with the gnawing sensation that they are being watched from the moment they leave the dock. The paranoia begins to rot the discipline of the fleet. Commanders start to second-guess their orders. They start to see phantoms on their sonar screens. They begin to execute wild, dangerous maneuvers, the famous Crazy Ivan, where a submarine suddenly turns 180 degrees to check its blind spot, the area behind the submarine where its own propeller noise blocks the sonar. In the Kremlin, the KGB is tasked with finding the answer. They are told to look for spies. They are told to look for new American radar systems. They are told to look for anything that explains why the ocean has eyes. But they are looking in the wrong places. They are looking at the sky, searching for satellites. They are looking at the hulls of their ships, searching for tracking beacons. They are interrogating their own sailors, searching for leaks. They do not realize that the answer lies in the one place they believe is safe, the deep, crushing darkness of the ocean floor itself. The impossible event encountered by Captain Kulikov was not a glitch. It was a demonstration of a capability so advanced, so secret, and so massive that the Soviet mind could not even conceive of its existence. The Soviets believe the ocean is a place of silence. They are about to learn that to the Americans, the ocean is a wired room. And the microphone has been on for 20 years. Moscow, the Ministry of Defense, 1979. The file on the desk of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, is stamped with the highest classification level available to the Soviet Union. Special importance. It is not a file about victory. It is a file about a ghost. Gorshkov is a legend. He is the man who transformed the Soviet Navy from a coastal defense force into a global superpower. He built the fleets that now patrol the world's oceans. But as he stares at the reports from the Northern Fleet, the legend feels powerless. The report from Captain Kulikov is not unique. It is merely the latest entry in a dossier that has been growing thicker for 5 years. The data is consistent, and it is maddening. Item 1. A Project 667. Yankee-class submarine carrying 16 ballistic missiles attempts to patrol near Bermuda. Within 6 hours of entering the sector, 2 US Navy destroyers box it in. Item 2. A Charlie-class cruise missile submarine attempts to transit the Giayuk Gap, the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. It runs deep and slow. It is intercepted by a British frigate that seems to be waiting at the exact exit point of the channel. Item 3. A frantic transmission from a submarine commander in the Pacific, claiming that American aircraft were dropping practice depth charges on his position while he was stationary and silent, hovering over a trench. Gorshkov lights a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the high ceilings of his office. He looks at his intelligence officers, the men from the GRU, military intelligence, and the naval staff. "Explain this," Gorshkov demands, his voice low, dangerous. "How do they know?" A colonel from the Naval Intelligence Directorate clears his throat. He is sweating. "Comrade Admiral, we have analyzed the acoustic profiles. Our submarines are quieter than they were 5 years ago. The Americans should not be able to hear us at these ranges. The physics of sound transmission do not support these intercepts." "Physics?" Gorshkov spits the word out. "Do not talk to me of physics. Talk to me of results. Are you telling me the Americans have rewritten the laws of nature?" We believe there must be a leak," the colonel says. "It is the safest answer in the Soviet Union. If technology fails, blame a traitor." This triggers the first phase of the investigation, the Great Witch Hunt. For the next 2 years, the KGB turns the Soviet Navy inside out. They are convinced that for the Americans to find submarines with such pinpoint accuracy, there must be a spy network of unprecedented scale operating within the Murmansk and Vladivostok naval bases. Counterintelligence officers swarm the docks. They interrogate the families of submarine crews. They bug the apartments of captains. They analyze the trash of the maintenance workers who install the rubber sound-dampening tiles on the hulls. They are looking for the golden source, the traitor who is broadcasting the fleet's movements to Langley. Men are fired. Careers are ruined. Some officers are quietly arrested and never seen again, accused of negligence or unauthorized communication. But the intercepts continue. If anything, they get worse. The Americans seem to be getting bolder. They are no longer just tracking the submarines. They are toying with them. American attack submarines, the fast, lethal Los Angeles class, begin to appear in the baffles, the blind spot behind the propeller, of Soviet boats, staying there for days, undetected, before pinging their sonar once to say, "You are dead," and then vanishing. The traitor theory begins to lose weight. No spy could possibly know the real-time position of a submarine that has been underwater for 3 weeks, running a random zigzag pattern in the middle of the Sargasso Sea. A spy on land can tell you when a ship leaves port. He cannot tell you where it is 1,000 miles later. The investigation shifts. If it is not a human, it must be a machine. The Soviet scientific community is mobilized. The Academy of Sciences sets up special committees to study non-acoustic detection. This is where the investigation takes a turn into the bizarre. The Soviets begin to believe that the Americans have developed technology that borders on magic. One prevailing theory is the satellite thermal scar. The Soviet scientists hypothesize that a nuclear submarine, even deep underwater, releases a tiny amount of heat from its reactor. This heat rises to the surface, creating a microscopic temperature difference on the waves, perhaps only a fraction of a degree. The theory goes that American spy satellites, equipped with impossible infrared sensors, can see these thermal scars from space. They believe the ocean is being scanned from orbit like an X-ray. The Soviets spend millions of rubles trying to counter this imaginary threat. They experiment with specialized paints. They try to design mixing systems to disperse the heat of the reactor water. They waste years chasing a ghost in the sky, looking up at the stars, convinced the eye of God is watching them from the vacuum of space. Another faction in the GRU becomes obsessed with wake detection. They believe the Americans can detect the microscopic changes in water density left behind by a submarine's hull, even hours after it has passed. They start designing sensors to measure radiation trails, chemical traces, even the magnetic anomaly of the steel hull moving through the Earth's magnetic field. They are overthinking it. They are looking for complex, exotic sci-fi solutions because they simply cannot accept the humiliating truth. Their quiet submarines are essentially loud tractors chugging through a library. The paranoia reaches the highest levels of the Kremlin. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB and future leader of the Soviet Union, becomes personally involved. He is a man who sees conspiracies in the shadows. To him, this American capability is a sign of a first strike preparation. If the Americans can see the Soviet missile submarines, they can destroy them. If they can destroy them, the Soviet Union has no deterrent. They are preparing for war, Andropov tells his inner circle. They are blinding us before they strike. The atmosphere in the Soviet naval bases changes from pride to dread. Submarine crews call their vessels iron coffins. They know that the moment they slip under the waves, they are likely already targeted. The bravado of the early Cold War evaporates. To fix this, the Soviet engineers are ordered to work harder. They are told to build the Black Hole, a submarine so quiet it cannot be heard. They begin work on the improved Kilo class and the Akula class. They steal Toshiba milling machines from Japan to create quieter propellers. They are desperate to close the gap. But even with these improvements, the ghost remains. In 1981, a Soviet intelligence ship, a trawler bristling with antennas disguised as a fishing vessel, is drifting off the coast of Iceland. Its mission is to monitor NATO communications. The radio operator on the trawler intercepts a strange signal. It is not a voice. It is not a standard radar pulse. It is a burst of data, a coded transmission going from a shore station in Iceland to a relay satellite, and then down to Norfolk, Virginia, the headquarters of the US Atlantic Fleet. The Soviet analysts break down the timing. 12:05 p.m., a Soviet Victor III submarine passes a specific coordinate near the Reykjanes Ridge. 12:05 p.m., the shore station in Iceland transmits the data burst. 12:15 p.m., a US Navy P-3 Orion takes off from Keflavik Air Base. 12:45 p.m., the Orion drops a sonobuoy right on top of the Victor III. The correlation is perfect. The Americans didn't find the sub with the plane. The plane was sent to the sub. The detection happened before the aircraft even took off. The realization hits the GRU analysts like a sledgehammer. The sensor is not on the plane. The sensor is not on a ship. The sensor is not in space. The sensor is fixed. It is a stationary object, and for it to detect a submarine hundreds of miles away, it must be massive. The Soviets frantically pull out their charts of the Atlantic Ocean. They look at the bathymetry, the map of the ocean floor. They look at the choke points, the gaps between the continents. They begin to suspect the unthinkable. What if the Americans have wired the ocean? What if they have laid cables, but the admirals dismiss it? Impossible, they say. To cover the Atlantic would require thousands of kilometers of cable. It would require microphones that can withstand the crushing pressure of the deep for decades. It would require a power source we cannot imagine. And the data, the sheer amount of noise. How could they filter the sound of a submarine from the sound of the ocean itself? The Americans are good, one admiral is rumored to have said, but they are not gods. They dismiss the cable theory because it is too ambitious. It is too expensive. It is too technically difficult. They are wrong. They are judging American ambition by Soviet limitations. They do not realize that while the Soviet Union was building tanks and missiles, the United States was investing in something else entirely: information dominance. While the Soviets were looking for a weapon, the Americans had built a nervous system. And the heart of this system was not a weapon at all. It was a project born in the desperate days of 1950, a project that had been running in total silence for 30 years. The Soviets are asking, where is the enemy? The answer is, you are swimming inside him. Naval Facility, Point Sur, California, 1981. While the admirals in Moscow were chasing thermal scars and radiation ghosts, the answer to their nightmare was sitting in a windowless concrete building perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of ozone and stale coffee. There are no windows. The only light comes from the fluorescent tubes overhead and the glow of banks of electronic consoles. The room is filled with the low, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of stylus needles dragging across moving rolls of sensitive paper. Seated in front of one of these consoles is not a spy, nor a scientist, nor a hardened commando. It is a 20-year-old sonar technician second class. He is drinking a Coke and staring at a sheet of paper that looks like a chaotic seismograph readout. To the untrained eye, the paper is a mess of static black squiggles representing the noise of the ocean. Shrimp snapping, waves crashing, the distant rumble of commercial shipping traffic. But the technician is not looking at the static. He is trained to look through it. He spots a faint vertical line emerging from the background noise. It is a discrete frequency, a constant tone. He adjusts a dial, refining the sensitivity. The line grows darker. He grabs a ruler and measures the spacing between this line and the faint harmonic lines appearing next to it. He checks a classified reference binder on his desk. The frequency matches the rotational rate of a specific type of reduction gear. The harmonic overtones match the blade rate of a specific 7-bladed propeller. He picks up a phone handset. "Watch, officer," he says calmly. "I have a contact, Sierra class signature. Sector 4, confidence high." He does not know exactly where the submarine is yet. He only knows it is out there, somewhere in the vast Pacific. But miles away, at another naval facility in Centerville Beach, another operator is seeing the same line. They triangulate. 2 lines cross on a map. The coordinates are relayed to the Fleet Ocean Surveillance Information Center. From there, orders are flashed to a patrol squadron. A P-3 Orion aircraft launches. The entire process takes less than 20 minutes. The Soviet submarine captain, thousands of miles away, cruising at a depth of 300 meters, believes he is alone in the void. In reality, his position has just been marked on a map in a room he doesn't know exists, by a system he cannot see. This is SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. It was the greatest secret of the Cold War. For decades, it was classified higher than the atomic bomb. While the public focused on the space race, rockets, moon landings, and satellites, the United States Navy was winning the ocean race with a project of equal complexity and arguably greater strategic importance. The origin of this impossible capability goes back to the early 1950s, to a discovery made by American scientists Maurice Ewing and Joe Wurzel. They were studying the physics of sound in the ocean, and they discovered a phenomenon that changed warfare forever. They found the Deep Sound Channel, also known as the SOFAR, Sound Fixing and Ranging Channel. The ocean is not a uniform block of water. It is layered. Near the surface, the water is warm. Deep down, the water is freezing and under immense pressure. Sound waves travel at different speeds depending on temperature and pressure. Ewing and Wurzel discovered that at a specific depth, usually around 1,000 meters in the Atlantic, these factors cancel each other out to create a sound duct. If you make a sound within this channel, the sound waves do not disperse. They get trapped. They bounce off the upper warm layers and the lower pressure layers, focusing the energy like a fiber optic cable made of water. The result was mind-bending. A small explosion detonated in the SOFAR channel near Australia could be heard in Bermuda. Sound did not just travel for miles, it traveled for thousands of miles. The US Navy realized the implication immediately. If they could place microphones, hydrophones, directly into this axis, they wouldn't need to be near a Soviet submarine to hear it. They could hear it from the other side of the ocean. This triggered Project Caesar. It was an engineering feat that rivaled the construction of the interstate highway system. Under the guise of oceanographic research, the US Navy, working with Bell Labs and Western Electric, began to wire the ocean floor. Massive cable-laying ships, looking like innocent merchant vessels, crisscrossed the Atlantic and Pacific. They carried thousands of miles of armored coaxial cable. At specific intervals, they lowered massive hydrophone arrays, structures the size of buses, packed with sensitive listening equipment, onto the seabed. They placed them at the strategic choke points, the Geopolitical Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, the continental shelf off the US East Coast, the waters surrounding Japan. By the time Captain Kulikov was taking his Victor-class submarine out in 1978, he was not entering a wild ocean. He was entering a studio. The genius of SOSUS was not just the cables, it was the processing. The ocean is loud. A single hydrophone array picks up everything. Whales, drilling rigs, surface ships, rain, tectonic rumbles. The raw audio is a deafening roar. The Soviets knew about the SOFAR channel, but they believed it was useless for tracking because the signal-to-noise ratio was impossible to overcome. You can't find a whisper in a rock concert. But the Americans had a secret weapon, LOFAR, low-frequency analysis and recording. American engineers realized that the human ear is easily overwhelmed, but the eye is not. They converted the sound into visual data. Instead of listening to the audio, SOSUS operators looked at gram writers, machines that burned spectral lines onto moving paper. This was the waterfall display. Every mechanical object has a fingerprint. A Soviet submarine is a machine. It has pumps circulating coolant. It has turbines spinning generators. It has gears turning the propeller shaft. These machines vibrate. And because they are bolted to the hull vibrates. It turns the entire submarine into a massive speaker diaphragm. These vibrations create low-frequency tones, 5 Hz, 10 Hz, 50 Hz. These low frequencies are the ones that travel best in the SOFAR channel. They slice through the water for thousands of miles without losing energy. The SOSUS operators didn't listen for the ping of active sonar. They looked for the lines. They knew that the Soviet November-class submarine had a specific turbo generator that hummed at exactly 60 cycles per second. If an operator saw a 60-cycle line appear on his paper, he knew a November was out there. They knew that a damaged propeller blade created a rhythmic beat on the display. They could track individual submarines by their maintenance issues. They could tell if a sub was speeding up, slowing down, or turning. By the 1970s, the system had evolved into a global network. The data from the hydrophones traveled through the undersea cables to shore stations, NavFax, where it was processed by supercomputers and analyzed by human experts. This was the shift in perspective that the Soviets failed to grasp. The Soviets were obsessed with platforms. They built bigger missiles, faster planes, deeper diving submarines. The Americans were obsessed with information. They understood that a weapon is useless if it cannot find its target, and a target is dead if it can be seen. While the KGB was hunting for spies in Murmansk, the real spies were the hydrophones resting in the mud of the Atlantic, silently waiting. The ingenuity of the American solution was its passivity. It emitted no energy. It gave no warning. When Captain Kulikov was pinged by the destroyer in Part 1, that was the kill shot. The Americans had been tracking him for 3 days prior. They watched him leave the Barents Sea. They watched him cross the Norwegian Sea. They watched him turn south. They handed him off from one SOSUS array to the next, like air traffic controllers handing off an airliner. They only sent the destroyer when they were ready to send a message. The technological gap was staggering. The Soviets were trying to make their submarines quiet enough to evade a ship listening from 5 miles away. They didn't realize they needed to be quiet enough to evade a microphone listening from 500 miles away. But the most devastating part of this mystery is not just that the Americans could hear the Soviets. It is what they heard. Because SOSUS was so sensitive, it didn't just pick up engine noise. It picked up transients. A wrench dropped on a steel deck plate. A hatch slammed too hard. The sudden rush of high-pressure air when a torpedo tube was flooded. There are stories, whispered among old SOSUS operators, of hearing the hull pops of Soviet submarines diving too deep, of hearing the terrifying sounds of mechanical failures miles below the surface. In 1968, when the Soviet submarine K-129 sank in the Pacific, the Soviets had no idea where it was. They searched for months and found nothing. The Americans knew exactly where it was. SOSUS had recorded the sound of the implosion. They triangulated the position to within a few miles, while the Soviets wept for their lost sailors and searched the wrong patch of ocean. The CIA was already building a massive ship, the Glomar Explorer, to go out and steal the submarine from right under the Soviets' noses. That was the power of the secret. It turned the ocean into a glass tank. But the Soviets were not stupid. They knew something was wrong. And eventually, the impossible event would lead to a confrontation that would shatter their confidence forever. The mystery was about to be solved, not by Soviet genius, but by an American betrayal. The reveal was coming, and it would shake the foundations of the Cold War. The ghosts were real, and they were listening. Leningrad, the Admiralty Boardroom, 1981. The answer to the mystery that had plagued the Soviet Navy for 2 decades did not come from a breakthrough in physics. It did not come from a brilliant deduction by the KGB. It came in a plastic garbage bag, dropped in a muddy park in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and flown via diplomatic pouch to Moscow. The ghost was finally unmasked. And the face of the ghost was not a machine, it was a traitor. For years, a US Navy warrant officer named John Walker had been selling cryptographic keys to the Soviets. He was the golden source the KGB had dreamed of. But for a long time, the Soviets did not understand the true value of what they were buying. They used the keys to read diplomatic cables and fleet orders. They treated it as tactical intelligence. But in the early 80s, a team of senior Soviet naval analysts finally put the pieces together. They used Walker's keys to decrypt a backlog of historical US Navy operational summary messages. The daily reports sent from the Atlantic Fleet headquarters to the Pentagon. They sat in a secure room in Leningrad, reading the translated transcripts. And as they read, the blood drained from their faces. They were reading their own obituary. The documents were not vague, they were precise, clinical logs of Soviet submarine movements. Message dated 14th October 1979, detected Victor II, class unit departing Murmansk. Tracking via Caesar Array B, signal strength strong, blade rate confirms unit is K488. Message dated 16 October 1979, unit K488 transiting Bear Island Gap, handing off to UK Array, maintain passive monitoring. Message dated 20 October 1979, unit K480 at station keeping in Sector 4. Acoustic signature suggests cavitation on number 3 propeller blade. The Soviet admiral reading the file dropped the page onto the mahogany table. The silence in the room was absolute. There were no satellites. There were no thermal scars. There were no radiation detectors. "They hear us," the admiral whispered. "They have always heard us." The shock was total. It was a moment of vertigo. For 20 years, the Soviet Union had believed they were playing a game of hide and seek in a dark forest. Now they realized the Americans had installed floodlights and removed all the trees. They looked at the maps provided in the American files. They saw the approximate locations of the SOSUS arrays. They saw the coverage zones. The Atlantic was not an open ocean, it was a kill box. Every single ballistic missile submarine, the pride of the Soviet nuclear deterrent, had been tracked from the moment it got its bottom wet. The impossible events, the destroyers waiting at the rendezvous points, the P-3 Orions dropping buoys on silent subs, suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The Americans weren't guessing. They were watching a radar screen. Except the radar was made of sound. The psychological impact on the Soviet high command cannot be overstated. It was a humiliation. It meant that trillions of rubles spent on the naval expansion had been wasted. It meant that if World War III had broken out in 1975 or 1978, the Soviet submarine fleet would have been wiped out in the first hour. Panic set in, but it was a cold, calculated panic. "We must fix this." The order came down from the Kremlin. "We must close the gap." The investigation was over. The frantic scrambling for answers was replaced by a frantic scramble for a solution. The Soviets now knew why they were being heard. The American reports were specific. Propeller cavitation, reduction gear whine, machinery tonals. The Americans were listening to the flaws in Soviet manufacturing. The Soviet defense industry was ordered to achieve the impossible, silence the fleet. But they hit a wall. They knew the theory of how to make a quiet propeller. You needed complex, computer-controlled curves to slice the water without creating bubbles, cavitation. But the Soviet Union did not have the tools to build them. Their heavy industry was great at casting steel, but they lacked the precision electronics and multi-axis milling machines required for such delicate work. So, they did what they had done with the SOSUS secret. They stole the solution. In one of the most damaging episodes of technology transfer in the Cold War, Soviet agents approached a Japanese company, Toshiba, and a Norwegian company, Kongsberg. They wanted 9-axis computer numerical control, CNC, milling machines. These were restricted technologies, banned from export to the communist bloc by international treaties. Through a complex web of shell companies and falsified end-user certificates, the deal was done. The machines were shipped to the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad. The result was the Akula-class submarine. The Akula was the response. It was the Soviet attempt to blind the SOSUS network. With the new Japanese milling machines, they carved propellers that were masterpieces of hydrodynamic engineering. They floated the machinery on active dampening rafts. They coated the hull in thick anechoic tiles. When the first Akulas slipped into the water in the mid-80s, the US Navy was shocked. The lines on the SOSUS screens, which had been bright and clear for decades, suddenly grew faint. The loud tractors were gone. The Soviets had finally built a shark. But here lies the tragedy of the Soviet system and the futility of their response. They had solved the technological problem, but they had failed the economic one. By the time the Akula entered service, it was the mid-80s. The Soviet economy was in freefall. The cost of building these titanium-hulled high-tech submarines was astronomical. They couldn't build them in mass numbers. They could only afford a handful. Meanwhile, the Americans had not stood still. While the Soviets were frantically trying to beat the passive listening of SOSUS, the US Navy was already moving to the next paradigm. They were deploying Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, SIRTAS, ships that dragged massive listening tails behind them, mobile versions of SOSUS. They were developing active low-frequency sonar, which didn't just listen for noise, but flooded the ocean with sound to light up even the quietest submarines. The Soviets were playing catch-up in a race that the Americans were changing every 5 years. The reveal of SOSUS broke the spirit of the Soviet naval doctrine. It forced them to confront the reality that quantity did not equal quality. They had built the largest submarine fleet in history, only to find out it was the largest collection of targets in history. The final blow to their confidence came not on the battlefield, but in the data. In the late 80s, a report circulated within the US Navy, later declassified, which noted a dramatic drop in Soviet submarine patrols. It wasn't just that they were running out of money, it was that they were afraid to go out. The commanders knew the wire was there. They knew the Americans were listening. And they knew that no matter how quiet the Akula was, the ocean was still the Americans' home turf. The mystery was solved. The ghost was a cable. But knowing the truth didn't save them. It only confirmed their defeat. The North Atlantic, 1987. The Cold War did not end with a nuclear flash. It ended with a ledger. It ended when one side realized that the cost of competing was no longer measured in money, but in the disintegration of their own society. And nowhere was this calculation more brutal or more undeniable than in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Navy had achieved what they believed was a miracle. They had fielded the Akula-class submarines and the improved Victor III-class submarines. These vessels were masterpieces of theft and engineering. They were quiet. In some conditions, they were quieter than their American counterparts, the early Los Angeles-class submarines. But it did not matter. The killer statistic of the naval Cold War is not the number of missiles or the tonnage of the fleets. It is the detection probability in the open ocean. According to declassified analysis from the US Naval War College, during the peak of the SOSUS era, the probability of a Soviet submarine being detected upon entering the Atlantic was not 50%. It was not 80%. it was effectively 100%. For every Soviet submarine that crossed the GRUK gap, there was a corresponding track file in a computer in Norfolk, Virginia. This reality forced a catastrophic strategic shift for the Soviet Union. Realizing that the Atlantic was a transparent ocean, the Soviet High Command was forced to abandon the dream of the Blue Water Navy that Admiral Gorshkov had spent 30 years building. They could no longer threaten the American coast. They could no longer guarantee that their missile submarines would survive a transit to their launch boxes near Bermuda. So, they retreated. They adopted the Bastion strategy. Instead of roaming the world's oceans, the Soviet ballistic missile submarines were pulled back. They were ordered to stay close to home, in the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, protected by rings of surface ships, aircraft and mines, often hiding under the polar ice cap where the background noise of grinding ice made SOSUS less effective. Think about the magnitude of that defeat. The United States Navy, with a passive system of cables and hydrophones, had effectively denied the Soviet Union access to 70% of the Earth's surface. The Soviet Navy, the second largest armada in history, was bottled up in its own backyard, afraid to venture out into the open water because they knew the big ear was waiting. The economic collapse. This technological defeat fed directly into the macro tragedy of the Soviet collapse. The story of SOSUS is the perfect microcosm of the economic war that destroyed the USSR. It is a story of asymmetric cost. The United States spent an estimated $16 billion, adjusted for inflation, on the entire SOSUS network over 40 years. It was expensive, yes, but compared to the cost of what it countered, it was a bargain. To defeat SOSUS, the Soviet Union had to redesign its entire naval architecture. They had to scrap huge portions of their fleet. They had to build expensive titanium hulls. They had to import illegal technology. They had to dedicate entire fleets of surface ships just to guard their submarines in the bastions. The Soviets were spending nearly 20% of their gross domestic product on defense, frantically trying to plug the holes in their security that American technology kept ripping open. The Americans were spending less than 6%. The SOSUS network forced the Soviets into a spending spiral they could not sustain. Every time the Americans laid a new cable, the Soviets had to spend billions to counter it. It was a war of attrition, but instead of bleeding soldiers, the Soviets were bleeding rubles, resources, and technical capacity. The imitation trap also played a fatal role, because the Soviets were always reacting, always trying to steal the milling machines or copy the designs to catch up. They never developed the indigenous innovation culture needed to leapfrog the Americans. They were running a race where the finish line kept moving, and they were wearing lead boots, the legacy of the wire. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended, but the cables remained. For years after the collapse, the SOSUS network kept listening, but the sounds changed. The menacing hum of the Typhoon-class submarines and the whine of the Victor-class submarines faded away, replaced by the silence of a demilitarized ocean. The legacy of SOSUS is paradoxical. It was a weapon of war that likely prevented war. Deterrence relies on certainty. If the Soviets had believed their submarines were invisible, they might have been tempted to strike, thinking they could get away with it. Or more likely, they might have panicked during a crisis, believing they had an advantage they did not actually possess. SOSUS provided the United States with information dominance. The American presidents, from Eisenhower to Reagan, knew exactly where the enemy was. They didn't have to guess. This reduced the paranoia. In Washington, when you know where the knife is, you don't lash out blindly in the dark. In the 1990s, the secrecy was finally lifted. The Project Caesar cover story was dropped. The US Navy did something extraordinary. They handed the keys to the scientists. The hydrophones that had once tracked nuclear Armageddon were now used to track whales. Marine biologists used the system to study the migration patterns of blue whales and fin whales across entire ocean basins, something that had been impossible before. They used it to listen to underwater earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The sword was not beaten into a plowshare, it was beaten into a stethoscope for the planet. Epilogue. Today, the ocean floor is more crowded than ever. Fiber optic cables carry the internet, our emails, our videos, our digital lives across the same abyssal plains where the SOSUS cables once lay in secret. But the game of ghosts has returned. A new generation of Russian submarines, the Yasen class, and Chinese submarines are entering the deep. They are quieter, deadlier, and more advanced. The US Navy is deploying new systems, unmanned underwater drones, satellite-linked sensors, and AI-driven acoustics to find them. Yet, the lesson of 1978 remains. Captain Kulikov, standing in his control room, believed in the silence of the deep. He believed that the water protected him. He was wrong. The true power of the Cold War was not the explosion. It was the knowledge. It was the ability of one side to turn the chaotic, noisy, dark ocean into a room with the lights on. The Soviet Union collapsed, not because it lacked courage, but because it was fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. In the end, the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal was not a missile. It was a microphone. And somewhere in the deep Atlantic, buried under decades of silt, the cables are still there. Silent witnesses to the greatest game of hide and seek ever played, waiting for the sound of the next ghost to rise from the dark.